Canada's public broadcaster, the CBC, says it's taking a break from Twitter after being labeled government-funded media on the platform. The broadcaster says that label does not apply to them, even though they are heavily funded by tax dollars, because Twitter's definition says government-funded media are organizations influenced to some degree by the government. It's sparking a heated online discussion, especially among people who don't like the CBC. CBC's Twitter account is looking a bit different today. The words government-funded media have now been added to the account by Twitter. So what does this mean? Well, according to Twitter's definition, government-funded media is defined as outlets where the government provides some or all of the outlet's funding and may have varying degrees of government involvement over editorial content. And the CBC has a problem with that. The CBC has 4 streams of funding, and yes, that does include government money. Lots of it. But the public broadcaster also makes money from advertisements, subscriptions, and financing. However, the CBC says where this Twitter label went wrong is that the Canadian government is not involved in any editorial content or decision-making. CBC Radio Canada is publicly funded through a parliamentary appropriation that is voted upon by all members of Parliament. Its editorial independence is protected in law in the Broadcasting Act, as we said in our statement last week. In addition, our journalism is independent and subject to our journalistic standards and practices, as well as an independent complaints process, the broadcaster said on Twitter. For Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, a big CBC hater, this was a win. Breaking: CBC officially exposed as government-funded media. Now people know it is Trudeau propaganda, not news, he wrote on Twitter today. It really isn't much of an expose, as Poilievre says. It's always been extremely public that the CBC is heavily funded by the federal government. Either way, some experts say this label fuels mistrust in the CBC, and now the public broadcaster is hitting pause on Twitter, writing, "Our journalism is impartial and independent. To suggest otherwise is untrue. That is why we are pausing our activities on Twitter." And the CBC isn't the only one. National Public Radio in the States, which has a much different funding structure than the CBC, quit Twitter altogether when they were slapped with the label. This whole ordeal started with the BBC, England's public broadcaster. It is now labeled on Twitter as publicly funded, but was first labeled as government-funded media. Around the same time, this interview between Elon Musk and a BBC reporter was being circulated on Twitter.
Because I've been using Twitter since you've taken it over for the last 6 months.
Okay, so then you must have at some point seen that for you hateful content. I'm asking for one example.
Right.
You can't give a single one.
And I'm saying...
Then I say, sir, that you don't know what you're talking about.
Really?
Yes, because you can't give me a single example of hateful content, not even one tweet. And yet you claimed that the hateful content was high.
Well...
That's a false.
No, what I claimed...
You just lied.
It'll be interesting to see if Twitter changes its mind on the CBC in the coming days.